Promises in JavaScript seems like a complex idea, but once you understand them, they are pretty helpful. According to MDN docs, the promise object represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. In simpler words, a promise is an object that may produce a single value sometimes in the future, either a resolved value or a reason that it's not resolved. Let's say the code highlighted in green is simple JavaScript code or synchronous code that will executed line by line, whereas the code highlighted in orange is asynchronous, which means it will not be executed in linear fashion. Instead, the execution will move on with a pseudo value, and this asynchronous code will be executed in the background. The pseudo value there is nothing but a promise that might be fulfilled later on. Let's say we have a program that performs 4 tasks and one of them, that is task 2, is asynchronous. On execution, program will execute and complete task 1, then it will execute task 2, but it won't be completed. Instead, a pending promise will be returned and execution will move on to task 3 and then task 4 and so on. Meanwhile, if the promise returned by task 2 is fulfilled, we can access it via .then method, or in case it throws an error, we can catch that error via .catch method. We will be understanding this by looking at actual code later on. Now, why do we even need promises? Well, they prevent long tasks such as HTTP requests or timeouts to pause or slow our main code. Since we can easily handle a promise anywhere in the code, they prevent us from getting stuck in what is known as callback hell. This is what it looks like. So we are having many nested callbacks, which makes our code unreadable. Promises are simply the best way of handling asynchronous functions. A promise at any given time has 3 states: pending, fulfilled, or rejected. Pending is basically an initial state of an unresolved promise. In future, a pending promise might become fulfilled if the operation was successful, or it might be rejected if the operation failed. These are the important points that we discussed before. Now let's write some actual code. We will start by console logging the start of our program. Then I'm making an HTTP request to URL, which if successfully executes will return a random animal fact. Axios is just a library for easily making HTTP requests and also supports promises. We will store the return promise in a constant call promise. Now we can call .then method on it and give it an attribute to receive the data. And we can simply console log the first result we got. We can also attach .catch in case some error occurs. And then we finally console log program finished. But on running this program, we find that program finished logs first, and after some time our facts got console logged. This is exactly the behavior I was talking about earlier. Now let us try to put this program finished inside .then, and now it's a bit better. The better way to mark things would be this: to mark promise resolved separately, and then we can say synchronous code was finished. Now let's try to call .catch method by providing a bad URL. Since this is not a valid URL, our promise will be rejected. But here we also have unhandled promise rejection warning. This is because ideally we should chain .catch method right after the last .then method. And we don't even need to store this promise in a separate constant here. We can just chain .then right after. Now .then and .catch methods themselves return promises. This means we can chain them. If a promise is resolved, we can do some actions on the data and then return it to a different asynchronous function that will do further processing and will return promise. This chain can go on and on. Let's look at an example by writing the received data to a text file. We will return the fact value from the first promise. This is a very important step. And chain another then method onto it. We add an attribute to receive the returned data and use fs.write file function to write to the text file. Now this is not an async function, but we are using this just to demonstration purpose to show how to return a promise to our next method. If we want, we can add various kind of asynchronous functions over here. As we can see, we get an expected output and a new file is created. So that was all about basics of promises. It's a very deep topic. If you want to dive in, I will refer MDN docs and W3 schools. If you want to create your own promises, it's a bit complex. First, you will have to learn about synchronous and asynchronous functions, async await, and yeah, that's all.